Necromunda is the most honest planet in Warhammer 40,000. Not the most dangerous, not the most evil, not the most grimdark, the most honest, because every other planet in the Imperium at least pretends. They wave flags, they build cathedrals, they tell you the Emperor protects, they give you the beautiful lie with full commitment and eye contact and a firm handshake. Necromunda doesn't bother. Necromunda looks you dead in the face on day one and says, you are raw material. You will be used, you will be replaced, and the machine will not notice when you're gone. That's not cruelty, that's honesty. The cruelty is that billions of people are born into this place every single generation, and somehow they still believe the machine cares about them. That's Necromunda. A planet so comprehensively terrible that it accidentally became the most psychologically realistic world in all of science fiction. A place where the architecture itself is a hierarchy, where poverty isn't a policy failure, it's load-bearing infrastructure, where the pyramid doesn't just describe society, it is the society. Physically, geographically, structurally, you can look up and see the people who own your life. You can look down and see who you're standing on. And every floor, in every direction, as far as the eye can see, someone is grinding someone else into paste and calling it civilization. 4 hives. 4 different flavors of the same cosmic joke. Hive Primus, where they sell you hope at full price and deliver nothing. Hive Trazior, where everyone is one deal away from making it and nobody ever makes it. Hive Secundus, where an entire city became so corrupted that the Imperium solution was to nuke it from orbit and then build a wall and pretend it doesn't exist, which, by Imperial standards, is actually a pretty mature response. And Hive Arcos, where the workers responsible for processing the dead eventually became something you'd need other workers to process. So, let's talk about Necromunda, the vertical meat grinder that somehow has a tourism board. What is a hive city, or how to build a civilization out of human suffering and structural engineering? Okay. Before we go deeper, we need to establish what a hive city actually is. Because if you've never engaged with Warhammer before, the concept is going to sound like I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect. I am not exaggerating for dramatic effect. I cannot stress this enough. Imagine a city, normal city, buildings, roads, people, the usual. Now imagine that instead of expanding outward, this city only ever expanded upward, for thousands of years, without ever stopping, without ever demolishing anything, without ever fixing the foundational problems before just building on top of them. Literally and metaphorically, the old problems don't get solved. They get buried, and then new buildings go on top, and new problems develop on top of those buildings, and then more buildings, and more problems, layer after layer after layer, like a geological record of every bad decision a civilization ever made, compressed into a tower that stretches miles into a sky so toxic that the atmosphere itself has given up trying to be breathable. That's a hive city. Now populate it with billions of people. Now make sure most of them will never leave their section of the hive, never see sunlight, never breathe fresh air, never know what a tree looks like outside of a low-resolution screen in a hab block that smells like industrial solvent and generational trauma. Now tell those people that if they work hard enough, they could climb. Now watch what happens. The Hive isn't a dystopia in the way most science fiction does dystopias. It's not a boot stamping on a human face forever well. It is, but it's more subtle than that. It's a boot that convinces the face that the stamping is actually a stepping stone, that the pressure is opportunity, that the weight is motivation. The Hive sells the idea of upward mobility to people who live in a place where upward mobility is a literal geographic concept, and uses that sale to keep billions of people from simply burning everything down, which is genuinely, terrifyingly, uncomfortably clever. And it works. That's the part that should keep you up at night. It works. Hive Primus, the algorithm of false hope. Let me describe Hive Primus to you in the most accurate way I can. Imagine if LinkedIn became a city. No, wait. Stay with me. Imagine if the entire ideology of LinkedIn, the hustle culture, the grind set, the I started from nothing, and now I run 6 companies energy, the bizarre mix of aspiration and quiet desperation and performative success. Imagine if that ideology was made physical, made architectural, made inescapable, turned into a multi-mile tower where your floor literally tells everyone around you how well you're doing, and the only way to move up is to either be born there or to sacrifice everything you have on the altar of a system that will consume you regardless. That's Hive Primus, the capital of Necromunda, the seat of power, the dream. And I want to be very precise about what I mean when I say dream, because this is important. The dream isn't real. The dream is a product. It is manufactured, packaged, distributed, and sold to people who have no other options, and it is specifically designed to be just plausible enough that no one ever fully gives up on it. Hive Primus doesn't run on Promethium or industrial output or tax revenue. Hive Primus runs on cope, industrial scale, systemically engineered, architecturally enforced cope. Think about it. You've got billions of people living in conditions so genuinely, catastrophically miserable that the words labor exploitation don't even begin to cover it. We're talking about generations of human beings who inherit their job from their parents, who inherited their job from their parents, who work in factories they'll never own producing goods they'll never use for a system that has never once considered their continued existence as anything more than a logistical necessity. These people have every reason to riot, every reason to burn it all down, every reason to look at the spire gleaming, elevated, disconnected, floating above them in literal architectural contempt and say, no, not today, not anymore. But they don't, not most of them, not enough of them. And the reason, the actual, psychological, deeply uncomfortable reason, is that somewhere in the back of every single one of their minds is a tiny, persistent, completely irrational little voice that says, maybe I'll be different. That voice is Hive Primus's most important product. It doesn't cost anything to manufacture. It regenerates automatically. It runs on human nature and the universal, maddening, beautiful, tragic fact that people can survive almost anything as long as they believe tomorrow might be better. The Spire, at the absolute peak of Hive Primus, because of course it is where the noble houses live. And I want you to understand these people, because they are not cartoonishly evil. Some of them are. Obviously, this is Warhammer. There's always someone in a fancy hat, being genuinely monstrous, but the really disturbing ones aren't the monsters. The really disturbing ones are the ones who genuinely believe they're doing good, who see themselves as guardians, shepherds, enlightened stewards of civilization. The people who look down literally, spatially, physically down at billions of suffering human beings and think, yes, this is right. This is the natural order. Someone has to be at the top, and it should be the people who are already at the top, because clearly, that's how it's supposed to work. The divine right of altitude. And here's the thing that makes Necromunda so much more interesting than a simple rich, bad, poor, good narrative. Some of them are actually right. Some of these nobles are genuinely competent. Some of them do keep the hive functioning. Some of them are capable administrators and military leaders without whom the whole structure would collapse and kill everyone beneath it. The system produces real value alongside the horror. The machine works, not for the people inside it, but it works. That's the philosophical trap at the center of Hive Primus. It's not a broken system, it's a functioning one. And it's functioning exactly in the direction that everyone at the bottom and nobody at the top wants to admit it's pointed. Upward, always away. Hive Trazior capitalism, with a gun and is smile. If Hive Primus is LinkedIn, Hive Trazior is crypto Twitter. Everybody is one deal away from making it. Nobody has actually made it. The whole thing is held together by vibes, speculation, and the collective agreement not to acknowledge that the floor might not be there. Trazior is Necromunda's great trading hub. Which sounds boring. Trade hub, warehouses, ledgers, whatever, until you realize that in a society built on scarcity and survival, trade doesn't look like a stock exchange. Trade looks like warfare with paperwork. Every transaction is a negotiation. Every deal is a power play. Every handshake has a backup plan for if the handshake goes wrong, and a backup plan for the backup plan, and someone watching from a building across the street, just in case. What Trazior actually trades is possibility, and here is where I want to stop and get uncomfortably real with you for a second. Possibility is the most addictive substance ever invented. More addictive than anything chemical, because at least chemicals have a ceiling. Possibility doesn't. Possibility can always recede a little further, can always be just slightly more attainable, can always whisper, not yet, but soon. Keep going. One more deal, one more shipment, one more risk. Trazior is a casino. A planet-sized, gang war-infested, occasionally explosive casino where everyone believes they're the one who has the system figured out, and nobody ever acknowledges the house always wins. Because the house isn't a person, or a faction, or a noble house. The house is the hive. The house is the system. The house is the invisible architecture of scarcity and dependency that makes sure no matter how well you do, you always need it to do better. The really frightening thing about Trazior isn't the violence, it's the hope, the same irrational, engineered, weaponized hope that powers Hive Primus, but in Trazior it's filtered through the language of agency. At least in Primus, you know you're stuck. In Trazior, you think you're choosing. You think each deal is a free decision. You think you're a player. The market has convinced you that you're participating, rather than being consumed. That's a much more elegant prison. Hive Secundus, the city that became the monster. Okay. Comedy breakover. We need to talk about Secundus. And I want you to feel the tonal shift here, because it's intentional. Because Secundus isn't funny. Secundus is what happens when the paranoia that's always been baked into Hive life, the suspicion, the tribalism, the distrust, the sense that someone somewhere is always working against you when that paranoia turns out to be justified, when the threat is real, when the conspiracy isn't a conspiracy anymore, because it's already won. Genestealers. I want to explain exactly why Genestealers are the most terrifying concept in Warhammer 40k, and it has nothing to do with their physical form. It's not their claws. It's not their speed. It's the infection. It's the cult. A Genestealer cult doesn't invade. It infiltrates. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't march armies through your gates. It shows up as one thing, one person, one organism, one seemingly isolated incident, and then it begins to spread. Quietly, generationally, through families, through bloodlines, through the slow, patient accumulation of compromised loyalties until the question of who can you trust stops having a clean answer. And this is where Genestealers become something deeper than a monster story. This is a story about how ideological corruption works. Think about it in non-fictional terms. Think about how any extremist ideology spreads. It doesn't announce itself. It starts at the margins. It finds people who are already alienated, already suffering, already looking for belonging. It offers community, purpose, identity, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself. And it spreads. Not because people are stupid, but because the thing it's replacing, isolation, meaninglessness, the grinding anonymity of being one of billions, is genuinely, authentically terrible. The cult offers something real. The horror is that what it's offering is also genuinely real. That's what happened to Secundus. The infection spread through people who were already at the bottom, already forgotten, already given every reason to feel that the Imperium, the Hive, the nobles in the Spire, none of them cared whether you lived or died. And into that void came something that said, "You are seen. You are part of something. You matter to us." And by the time anyone in power noticed what was actually happening, the cult wasn't hiding in the city anymore. The cult was the city. The response was orbital bombardment. The dust wall. Containment rather than cure. A wall that is functionally an admission. We broke something we don't know how to fix, so we're just going to put a barrier around the broken thing and collectively decide not to think about it. Which is, when you think about it, not so different from how the Hive treats its Underhive, or its sump, or its poor. Build a wall. Call it infrastructure. Move on. Hive Arcos, the machine that manufactured its own nightmares. And then there's Arcos. Arcos is the one that gets me. Not because of the horror, though the horror is significant, but because of the logic. Because Hive Arcos is the most internally consistent story on all of Necromunda. Because everything that happened there was inevitable. Not in a fatalistic, predetermined sense, in a structural sense. In the sense that you could look at the conditions and know, with reasonable certainty, that this was always going to end this way. Arcos had corpse grinders, and before you laugh, and I know how that sounds, understand what I mean. Every hive city produces death at industrial scale, billions of people living in toxic conditions, doing dangerous work, fighting gang wars, dying of preventable diseases. The hive doesn't stop for grief. The hive doesn't have a funeral industry. The hive has a waste management protocol, and someone has to operate it. Someone has to take the endless, ceaseless, overwhelming accumulation of human death and feed it into the machinery of the hive, which processes it, recycles it, and converts it into something useful. Imagine being that person. Imagine your father was that person. Imagine your grandfather was that person. Imagine you are born into a world where your assigned function in the vast apparatus of civilization is to stand between the living and their own mortality and keep the gears turning. Every day, every shift, every generation. No glory, no recognition, no philosophical distance. Just death and the machinery it feeds, and the knowledge that somewhere above you, in the Spire, there are people who benefit from everything you do and will never, ever think about you. At some point, something changes, not all at once. These things never happen all at once. It starts with a different relationship to death, of familiarity that crosses into something else. Then a different relationship to the people above, to the system, to the hierarchy that put you here. Then a different relationship to what you're doing, and what it means, and who decides what has value, and who gets to decide that, and why, and on whose authority, and by what right. And then, gradually, inevitably, structurally, the workers responsible for processing the dead became something that the system needed other people to process. The corpse grinder cult wasn't an outside infection like Secundus. There was no alien pathogen, no cosmic horror from beyond the stars. This was entirely homegrown. This was manufactured. By the hive. By the conditions. By the decision, made and renewed every single generation, to take human beings and assign them a function so dehumanizing and so isolated from meaning that the humanity had to go somewhere, and what it couldn't sustain, it transformed. Necromunda built its own monster. The hive looked into itself and found that it had been manufacturing horror the whole time, tucked in a department nobody visited, on a floor nobody mapped, doing work nobody acknowledged. That is the real story of Hive Arcos, not a cult, not a rebellion, a system producing the exact outcome it was always going to produce if you ran it long enough and paid close enough attention. The pyramid never ends. Conclusion. So, 4 hives, 4 stories. Primus manufactures false hope and calls it civilization. Trazior manufactures false agency and calls it opportunity. Secundus manufactures paranoia and calls it a containment problem. Arcos manufactures horror and calls it a labor incident. But here's the thread that runs through all of them. The thing Necromunda is actually, under everything, fundamentally about. Strip away the hive towers, remove the chainswords and the bolters, and the toxic atmospheres, and the gang colors, and the noble houses, and the Genestealer cults. Strip it all the way down. What's left? Hierarchy, status, fear, greed, hope, desperation. The need to believe you're climbing even when the evidence suggests you're being ground up. The same forces that have organized human societies since before we had words for them, just exaggerated here, scaled up, made physical, made architectural, made impossible to ignore until they become impossible to pretend, aren't present everywhere you look. That's why Necromunda isn't a warning about the future. It's not a prediction about what happens if things go wrong. It's a description of mechanisms that already exist, rendered in extremes extreme enough that you can finally see the shape of them clearly. Everyone in the hive is climbing. Everyone believes happiness is 1 floor up, one promotion up, one victory up, one rung of the ladder up. And the ladder is real. The climbing does happen, occasionally, for someone, which is exactly why the system survives. Because if nobody ever made it, nobody would try. But just enough people make it to keep the rest trying. Just enough success to justify infinite effort. Just enough upward movement to make downward movement feel like personal failure rather than structural inevitability. The pyramid never ends, not because it's infinitely tall, but because if everyone reached the top, there'd be nobody left at the bottom holding it up, and someone always has to be at the bottom. That's not a flaw in the design. That's the design. Welcome to Necromunda. Population: everyone who ever believed the system was going to take care of them. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. You're going to want to know when the next one drops. Trust me on this.